Hey, creative souls, writers, word witches, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I'm very happy that you're here and that you've chosen to take the time to watch and subscribe for those of you who have. And if you haven't, I hope that you will after you watch this video, if it resonates with you, or if you've watched any of my other videos and haven't subscribed yet, I would sincerely appreciate it. I am trying to reach 500 subscribers by the end of December. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Johnny. You can learn more about me on my website, johnnymazalco.com. Visit my blog, Writing Through the Body. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and Substack. So, I recently finished reading a novel called Disclaimer. And in this video, I will talk about it for a couple of reasons. So, first, it's, I think, an interesting and informative example of story with shifting points of view and changing tenses. And then also because it was adapted to a TV series. If you haven't watched or read the story, I won't give any spoilers, so you can proceed without being concerned about that. First, I want to start with a summary of the novel, and I found a good one on a blog called Fictionophile, and so I thought I would just read that to you. It says, in Renee Knight's psychological thriller Disclaimer, documentary filmmaker Catherine Ravenscroft discovers a mysterious novel titled The Perfect Stranger, which seems to be about her, right at her bedside. Though the book's disclaimer states its fictional nature, its vivid details depict a dark, long-buried secret from Catherine's past that only she and one other person knew, and that person is now dead. Plunged into a living nightmare, Catherine must confront this shocking truth to save herself and her family, even as the past threatens to destroy everything she holds dear. All right, so it's a bit of a thriller. Um, as I mentioned, it uses alternating perspectives. So some from Catherine Ravenscroft's point of view, hers is in third person. And then another character, Stephen Bridgestock, who plays a big part in the story, his point of view is first person. Um, and then, if I'm remembering correctly, yes, okay, this is in, I'll bring this up again, but in the series adaptation, there's also a second person point of view. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. But so, what does this multi point of view approach do? It allows Knight, the author, to provide more complex storytelling. And, as I said, in Catherine's sections, which are in third person in the book, it provides the reader with this more distance look at her. So it puts us kind of in a position to judge and scrutinize her. And then Stephen's sections are in first person. And so these take the reader kind of into a more intimate experience into his world. And we can feel his emotions and really deeply understand his reasoning. And I would say at the beginning of the story, we are more with him and his point of view. And then the shifting point of view also creates a kind of uncertainty that's really helpful in storytelling because it keeps readers engaged, right? It creates questions for us. And, we aren't sure really what or who to believe much of the time. And then the temporal shifts, we go back and forth between the past and the present. And this also adds to that kind of uncertainty. And, we get these events from about 20 years prior, and then those of a more recent period when Catherine receives the novel. That seems to expose her secret. And we aren't privy to what that secret is for quite a while. We only see the inner turmoil that it is causing her. And so the effect of this, using these different points of view and varying tenses, what this does is it really helps gradually build by revealing both sides of a story in increments, right? And that's done through past events, it's done through notebook entries, and it's done through photos. And, the photos are referenced in the novel And obviously, we can't see them. There are no photos in the novel. Um, but then in the adaptation, we see those as well. So this volleying back and forth kind of helps the reader construct a story in their mind, but the story keeps changing, right? And although I think that it is tilted in one direction more than the other, I just hope you will watch and read and let me know in the comments what you thought. So I want to say a little bit more about this changing tenses, going to the past and coming to the present, before I move on to themes. So one thing this shifting tense does is it deepens characterization because, we in a story like this, we get to visit the characters' backstories in depth and they get to be dramatized. Because typically the rule is that we don't want to burden the story or the reader with too much backstory, right? Just enough. But in a story like this, you really do need to delve more deeply into that. And so it creates this nice dramatic effect. And because the past is what informs the present, and when we see more of the past being revealed, then we can start to understand what this panic is that she's carrying around with her. And it shows us what might shape their present motivations and choices and their actions. And another thing it does is it increases complexity and suspense. So I think I may have alluded to this a minute ago, but alternating timelines create this dramatic irony. And, this is where the reader gets to know information that the characters do not in some cases. And this is a really good way to build suspense um, as to how past events will affect the future or the present in the story. Shifting tenses also controls the flow of information. So writers can reveal information in a very strategic way when they use a shifting tense, um, because we can hold back certain details until the right moment to build a more compelling narrative, right? So in some cases, um, it's really helpful to withhold information because then that keeps that peak interest from the reader and it will keep them engaged and wanting to turn the page. And then the last point on this is that using a shifting tense provides a non-linear structure. And it really allows, I think, for a more interesting and less straightforward narrative by moving away from just the simple chronological approach. All right, so let's talk about themes now. There are a lot of them in this. And I would say most novels maybe have one overarching theme with lots of other themes under that umbrella. So here are the themes that I recognized in this novel, or in this story. So revenge and justice is a big, big theme. Um, and again, I won't say much because I don't want to spoil some of the detail, but it is definitely a revenge story. And I love revenge stories. Some of my favorites are revenge stories. And I might even do a whole video now that I'm thinking about it on revenge stories. This one has a bit of a twist to it, and that's all I will say. Um, but I hope you're intrigued enough just by that to have a watch, or a read, or both. And then grief is another really strong theme in this. And there's just this huge undertone of grief. It's kind of a heavy story, so you need to know that. If stories like that bother you, then maybe it's not for you. Um, but if you can, shoulder the weight of that, then it's a very good study in these points that I've already made. And it also, I think, speaks to the way grief can color our memories, because memory can be a very subjective thing, I think. Um, my memories are different than some of my family members. And whether that's just selective memory on their part, and they might say, I have a fantastical memory and make shit up, um, there's that too. So I think grief is an interesting theme to kind of reckon with in a story. Um, and it's definitely a prevalent theme in my novel, Miranda's Garden, which, by the way, I don't know if I have said this previously. I'll be mentioning this in probably almost every video, so get used to it. My novel, Miranda's Garden, comes out May 1st next year, 2026. So be on the lookout for more information about that. Another theme in Disclaimer is consequences. Um, and every story is loaded with consequences because, as I always say, the way that we can start to build a story trajectory, once we have our character, especially our protagonist, kind of sorted out in our minds with some clarity, is to think about, their deepest desire, what action they will take to get it, and then that action every time creates a consequence which then starts it over again. Based on that consequence, they have to take another action, and on and on and on, right? So that is present in every story. However, in this story, it is a theme. And it really, I think, deals with how every choice that we make leads to a consequence. And sometimes those consequences are not revealed until many, many years later. Which is a scary thing when you think about it. It's like, are we all living with a ticking time bomb inside us? Um, because we all have things from our past that we are not proud of, that, maybe we were shamed for, or we feel a sense of shame over, and we think, oh, if anyone ever knew that about me, it would be the end of my world. And it's just part of being human. And I feel like one thing Knight, the author, does, Renee Knight, in this story that she created is I think she really captures the kind of fragility in humanity and how when humans are doing human things, it can create unfortunate situations. And again, it depends on that point of view. And then it also, another theme in this story is family and relationships. And, first it's between spouses. So there's Catherine and her husband, who is played by what's his name? Sacha Baron Cohen. Anyway, I'm sure you know who I mean. Um, and then it's also between parents and kids because Catherine has a son. And then there's this ripple effect that the past can have on the present and future in our relationships, as I was saying earlier. And then there is another theme is the burden of secrets. So when we hold secrets, they eventually will blow up in our faces. It's just a fact. It cannot be contained. And side note, we are seeing that in the world playing out in real time with the administration and the Epstein files. Secrets cannot forever be suppressed without some kind of negative outcome. And so this story, disclaimer, is really about the burden of secrets. And again, it's a really heavy story. The subjectivity of memory and truth is another theme. So memory and truth, as I said earlier, is very subjective. And, truth also is. My truth is different from your truth and from the next person's truth. And so um, I think it does a good job of exploring that. And then the last theme is fear of public humiliation because Catherine is a public persona. She's a documentary filmmaker, as I mentioned in that summary at the beginning, and she's well known. And so things like this coming out when you're a well-known person uh, could be very tragic in some cases. So in this novel, Renee Knight took on quite a bit, um, thematically and also structurally. And so I don't know, I just had a lot of respect after, especially reading the novel. I watched the series first and then read the novel. Um, so I want to say a bit about what critics have said about the novel before we get to the series. So first, the praise. Critics said that it was a gripping premise. They liked the pace of it, especially the second half. They liked how the structure creates the suspense and keeps it alive. And they liked the handling of both male and female perspectives. And I also thought that was done very well. And then here's some critiques about what some critics consider weaknesses. Pacing in the early portion was too slow. I think that's very subjective. Alternating timelines was confusing. Some did not like the ending. Some thought that it was a stretch, and some thought that the character responses and reactions were not convincing. And some thought that some of the plot elements were implausible and that connections were weak in some places. But to all that, I say a big fat whatever. I love analyzing fiction and, exploring their structures and meanings to gain really an understanding about the emotional impact that was created through technical choices by the author, by the creator. And I don't love what critics do with fiction or anything else, to be honest. And there's a quote I always like to remember, and I'm sure this is a paraphrase, but word has it, it's been passed down supposedly, that one thing Beethoven said to a critic is, "What I shit is better than anything you could ever think up." So, like I said, does not sound probably like Beethoven would have talked, but you get the idea. And, I think it's important to remember that critics are compelled to find flaws. And I just think, what a shitty way to make a living. Look for what doesn't work. And, I think critics are often academics who don't write fiction, but they merely study it. And I think if you don't write it, you have no business critiquing anything if you don't take part in the practice of making it. I think critics are often other writers who feel the need to be competitive, and there's a whole lot of that. I've spoken to this in other videos, and I think it's just a bunch of horseshit and juvenile to be competitive about something that's creative, about your creative pursuit. But there are people who they are just freaking arrogant, or they lack self-worth, which I think arrogance is a cover up for that. So I think it comes down to self-worth. But this attitude, I think, sometimes makes me appear to be not very discriminating or that I'm too soft and I don't think critically. But I think this is all relative. To be honest, I think there are ways to deconstruct a piece of work without trying to tear it down. And I had a problem with this when I got my MFA because I was seen as not very discriminating. And I think my professors and some of my fellow grad students thought that I didn't understand how to take a critical approach to art. Um, but I just couldn't stand it. Like, this put up a piece of art and then say, what's wrong with this? Um, I don't know. It's just not how my brain works, and it's not how I consume art. I would rather enjoy it, and whether it's a piece of art, like a painting or a novel or a movie, and just get what I get out of it and let it be what it is. And I think Disclaimer is worth a read and a watch. All right, so this takes me to the adaptation of the series, which was written and directed by Alfonso Cuarón. And in it, Cate Blanchett stars as the older Catherine, and Kevin Kline is Stephen Bridgestock. In the book, there is a lot of mystery, like who sent the novel to Catherine. And in the series, this is revealed much sooner. Also in the series, because it uses cinematic techniques. And Entertainment Weekly spoke to this. It talked about how the series uses shifts in color to create tone shifts between the past and the present, and it also reinforces emotional differences between the characters and between time periods. And then Screen Rant also points out that the show uses narrative voice in a different way. So I think I mentioned this earlier. So second person narration is used by Catherine in the series. And, I did which story was it? Lori Moore short story, How to Be a Writer. I did a video on that. And I kind of deconstructed and analyzed that story. And it's all written in second person. And as I always say, second person is very risky. That's why it's not used very often, but it can be very effective. And, one thing it does is it tells the reader or the viewer what they're thinking and feeling. And, the caution always is that that can seem kind of aggressive and off-putting. It can also be a way to really like grab the reader and put them in the body of that protagonist. And I thought in this case, I thought it was effective. And then here's what critics say about the adaptation. So there was praise for the performances, especially Blanchett and Klein. And I would agree with that. I have had a crush on Kate Blanchett for years and years. I think she is just stunningly phenomenal at her craft, and I admire that a lot. And then Rolling Stone liked the production value, so the direction and the cinematography, I agree, lovely cinematography, and just the atmospheric kind of vibe of the whole thing. And Rolling Stone also thought that the tension is well maintained in the series, and I would agree with that. And then Screen Rant and Slant Magazine say that by revealing certain things earlier or by dramatizing aspects, the show loses some of its mystery, or shifts where the viewer's attention is. So, it's more like the show focuses more on the truth of the perspectives of these characters than on who did it. And for some viewers, that changes some of the puzzle aspect that made the book compelling. But again, I say big deal. One of my film professors always said that it's really ridiculous to compare a novel and a film adaptation of that novel because they are two completely separate works of art. They are two completely separate mediums. And vastly different choices need to be made by the creator, by the makers. Um, and so when anyone says, "Oh, I like the book better," I mean, obviously, you can go into far more depth in a novel because you have more space. And so I think when we look at adaptations of novels, we need to use a different set of criteria rather than just compare it to the book. And you know what? I think I will also make a video about that. How to view and maybe deconstruct, or critique a screen adaptation of a novel. The Nation also said that the series sometimes flattens subtlety and in favor of spectacle or drama. And it says that some character motivations feel less believable on screen than on the page, or they are less explored. And again, you can only do so much in a series, right? Or a film or whatever. And again, to all that, I say whatever. You have to make choices when you move from text to visual. And that's the prerogative of the director. They get to do what they want to do. It's their vision. So I think things worth thinking about in terms of looking at text version of a story and a screen version is really how the medium changes, and what can be left ambiguous, right? So what needs to be shown and what works, or how do I say this? What needs to be shown and what works best in terms of when to show it. Because that's part of the art, right? In telling a story. I think also whether the change in, revelation timing, like who sent the book in this case, shifts the viewer's empathy or alignment among the characters. So in the book, as I mentioned earlier, you might spend more time thinking, who sent this book? Whereas in the show, you might instead focus more on the moral ambiguity. So who is telling the truth? And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for one to do one thing and one to do the other. I think it's perfectly fine for that. The role of visual style in underscoring themes like memory and guilt versus the book's reliance on narrative voice and internal monologue. So again, it's understanding the medium that you're working in and the tools that you have available to you to tell the story. And I will say this, it is not easy adapting from print to screen. When I was teaching at the prison, I had one guy who had been in my fiction class and wrote a short story that everybody loved. And then he opted in my screenwriting class to adapt that story. And I told him over and over that it is a very hard thing to do. And he thought he would just be able to transplant scenes over and put it in script format and it would work. And it didn't work. And, we were kind about it in class, but as we were reading it, he could see clearly that it did not work. And he got upset and didn't want to take part in the class anymore, which is very disappointing. I tried to convince him otherwise, but um, so anyway, just know that if you want to do that, you will end up with a different feeling kind of story. And I'm sure others exist, but the one I'm thinking of now that was adapted from a novel into a film was Like Water for Chocolate. And part of that may be because the author of the novel wrote the script and her husband, I believe, directed it. And so when you have a very close collaboration like that, um, and it also was a story that translated very well from the page to the screen. So a lot of things go into making the decision to do that and then executing it. So in summary, I would say both of these are worthwhile. I think they're worth your time. And, I think it's helpful to read and to view this story because it's helpful to see how story can shift and change depending on the medium. I think it's a very interesting course of study, to be honest. And then I'm curious, have you read or watched Disclaimer? And if so, I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. And if you maybe have read and not watched or vice versa, I invite you to do the other and just see the differences. And I'd love to know in the comments your thoughts about it. And also, if you like this kind of video where I talk about an adaptation from a novel to the screen, please let me know in the comments and I'll do more of them. All right, I love doing them myself, but I want to make sure that I'm giving you things that you enjoy and that are helpful to you. So as always, I send you mad writing mojo. Happy writing.